actual site here. There we go, perfect. So today we're going to talk about custom views and reporting. Those are kind of two sides of the same coin here. But there's different ways to go around building reports here in Workamajig, and there's kind of a lot of little things to know about where to find the details. So we're going to cover a couple of major points here today. Primarily what our reporting engine is and does. I'm sure the is fairly obvious, but what it does is quite a bit, actually. I think the reporting engine here in Workamajig is one of the best parts of the system. There's a lot of different ways to pull detail in Workamajig and to pull it outside of the system or to create custom listings that get you specific detail that you're looking for. Now, this is a webinar, so obviously it's just going to be a lot of me talking. I will be stopping for questions. So if you have a question at any point, don't hesitate to chime in on the chat or the Q&A section. You can also raise your hand, do a little dance. I'm not sure if I'll see it, but it will probably brighten all of our days. So again, thanks for joining us here. Let's go ahead and get underway. And let's start with an overview of the reporting engine and system here in Workamajig in the first place. Reports in Workamajig are broken out into a couple of different areas, and they're not really different areas, but they do have distinct ways that you can approach building them. And one's kind of they're used for different purposes depending on what you're looking to get out of the system here. So the first one that you're probably familiar with if you've been in Workamajig and you've been on any of our Today page are the views types of reports here. Everything in Workamajig is built off of some type of data set. So views are a way for us to say, okay, if you're looking at a view of any one of these items here on the Today Project Manager or the Today Billing page, for example, these reports here are one line per this type of data. So if we see project requests or we see projects, you know that when you're looking at a view, it's always going to give you one line per project or one line per project request, depending on the type of view that you're building here. A lot of times for my newer agencies, when I'm training them here in Workamajig, or if someone's new to the reporting engine, I typically tell them to start here for a couple of reasons. One, views are pretty easy to work with, partially because of what I just said. You know that you're getting, one line per project, one line per campaign. And two, that it's a really great introduction to how to build reports in general in the first place here. So with views here in Workamajig, a lot of these are pre-built into the system. If I click projects here, the default here is these 3 reports. You can add more projects to this list. That's one of the things that more reports to this projects list if you'd like. And that's one of the things that we'll be talking about here today. But for views, we're always copying from some existing set. And when you're first starting, actually, even after you're not first starting, I almost recommend copying from the all data set so that you're getting everything that's within that data set, and then you can filter or group however you'd like in the report itself. The other type of reporting, which again is not really different, the way the reporting engine works is the same between the two of these, is in your report center here. The major difference is really where you're going to see these and how you go about building them. So where for views, you would typically copy a view and then adjust it. And again, we're going to cover that here in a bit today. These custom reports here are typically built from the ground up. Now, there's a lot of standard reports in here. We'll be talking about those. These are system-based reports. Some of them are custom coded to get you information in a way that's a little bit easier to read. I'll kind of take you through some of the greatest hits and some of the ones that I personally think are very useful in this standard set of reports. But from a custom report building standpoint, the reason we're here is this custom area. You can build custom reports here in Workamajig. These would typically be built from the ground up. Again, you'd be picking from a specific data set. We're going to do this here today too. We're going to probably do it with a time detail report, looking at time entries here and how to group them and how to pull reports on them. But this is distinct because a lot of the reports that you build here, let's say the vast majority of them, will live in this report center itself. Kind of two different ways to approach building reports here in the system. We're going to start with views because, again, I think that's a really great starting place if you're new to reports here in Workamajig. And then we're going to come over here and build a custom time report and look at a couple of different options that we have here for it. Now, just a few words on our report system here in general in Workamajig, and a few things I think are helpful to understand. I've mentioned a few times the data sets that you're building reports on. That's very important when you're looking to build a certain report, because typically you're approaching a report with a certain idea, right? I want to know all time entered by clients, or I want to see all projects created last year, or something to that effect. So when you're approaching that here in Workamajig, one of the first things that I think is useful to do is to figure out which data set that you can build it on. If we're looking at something where we want to return time detail, for example, I want to know how much time was spent per project or per client or per service, whatever type of grouping that you'd like in there, probably makes sense to look at time detail when you're building that, right? Something that looks at the time level. And that's really what I mean when I say data sets. In Workamajig, a lot of the data is hierarchical. So if we're looking at campaigns, for example, I'm not sure if you're all familiar with them, but if we look at campaigns in Workamajig are basically just a group of projects. And a project is going to be a group of tasks, and those tasks will have time entries. So if we look back, we're kind of saying this is at our top level, right? If we're looking at campaigns, we're very far removed from the nitty-gritty detail of the items that are entered onto the projects that are a part of that campaign. So understanding those relationships is really helpful. If I'm building a time report and I want to see time per campaign, I can pull a campaign-based report here. I can spit out a line that says actual hours. But since campaigns are kind of very far off of that ground floor of transaction level detail, really all I'm going to get typically is just the total of the actual hours. If I really want to jump into the details of those time entries, might be best to kind of start at a time, something that's a little bit more raw, and then kind of fold the data in from there. That being said, you may just care about how many hours are entered into a campaign versus the budget. The campaign report would be great for that. Versus the budget, we can return the difference between those two. So kind of understanding those relationships and understanding that when you're approaching it, looking at the level of detail that's relevant to the type of report that you're building is pretty important. And that's another reason that I recommend starting with views. Again, these are really easy to understand. I know I'm getting projects. I want a project-based report. I want one line per project. This project view will do a perfect job of that for me. All of the same things apply if I'm really interested in the nitty-gritty of the transactions, the time or expense entries that are on those projects. I probably want to go a little bit deeper. But let's start here with projects. This is a pretty common view to build additional views on top of here. And again, views are always looking one line per this data. So if I'm approaching building a custom report here as a view in projects, I'm going to go ahead and jump into these here. Again, we have system reports for pretty much every data set, actually every data set in the system here. They'll all be views. There'll all be a couple of them. At the very least, they'll have all of whatever type of data that you're looking at. So all projects, all expense reports, all client invoices, they'll all be there. And again, I typically recommend building a view from the all version of whatever data set that you're looking at. This kind of ensures that you won't have data that's filtered out already in the report, so you're not missing anything when you build it, kind of starting with everything and then winnowing down to what we specifically need on a report. So if I jump into the all projects view here, you've probably seen some reports here in Workamajig. My guess is that a few of you have actually used them, but real quick, I'm going to lay out what this looks like. First, we have the area where it will show all of your projects here, the actual data produced. You can, again, see it's one line per project. So this project number gets its own line and so on and so forth. And then we can determine the columns that are printed out here on the view itself, as well as the filters that popped up when we first pulled this up. So the modify area is where we actually do all of those things here. And if we jump into modify, we can kind of see how this was put together and why it operates the way that it does. And there's really three major sections to the modify area: your layout, your filters, and your settings. Starting with the layout, this is obviously what you get in the report itself. And this is separated between groups and columns. So right now I have an ungrouped report, just kind of spitting out every single project that I have in my instance here. I haven't filtered anything, so it's everything I've built in this test site since I've opened it up here. Beneath that here, it's the actual columns of data that we have coming out of the system here. You can adjust these. So if you want to change them, you can actually just click into the fields here to change them around. If you want to remove anything, you can click this little red trash can here. But to insert rows here, if you're inserting additional rows in the columns themselves, you'll get this dropdown that will show you all of the different fields that are within a data set. Now, I've had a few clients that have gone through these lists exhaustively and looked at everything that's in here. There's quite a bit in here. It can actually be a little bit daunting. So I don't necessarily recommend reading through everything that's available to you. Typically, the best way to approach this is to say, okay, what type of data am I looking for in this report? And starting to search for it. So if I actually start typing any text into a new row here, let's say I want to see this current total budget field or the actual hours. Let's do that. We have no actual hours here. So I can go ahead and just type in hours or actual, and it will give me everything that's associated with that term, right? So if I'm looking for hours specifically, these are all of the different options that you have. So if I click actual hours, it adds that to the report. If I want to move this around here, this actual hours field, I can go ahead and drag it around and say, okay, let's go ahead and dump this right after the account manager. And let's add another row for the current budget hours. Again, so I could have just typed in hours, I typed in budget or current budget. This works either of the two ways, but I can go ahead and stack these two next to each other so I get something in the report that's a little bit more helpful for me. So if you make any changes on this page here, you can go ahead and click on the Apply Changes option. That will change the grid for you. One thing to note about after you do that, we only pull the information that you originally requested on a report. So you may notice my actual hours and my current budget hours fields are completely blank here. But if I search the report again, it will grab all that detail for me here. And it's also subtotaling those totals for me here at the bottom. So we can see overall, it looks like I've slightly overworked all of the budgets for all of the projects I've created here in Workamajig. Occasionally, I'm not so great about putting the budgets in the system here for these test projects, but hopefully you don't have the same problem. But you can see that they were added here, and searching pulls those back up. So the columns are kind of obviously one of the first places you want to start, right? What detail do I want in the report here itself? Searching through these is to me way more useful than just kind of scrolling through and trying to find the specific detail that you're looking for. And the other side of this are your groupings. And groupings are really useful, not just for readability for a report, but also to subtotal within a group. So you can say, you know what, I have all these projects here across different clients. All of these are Acme Incorporated, but I promise I have a few other test clients in here as well that also have projects open for them. So right now, when I look at this report, it's kind of spitting out totals here, especially in the number fields that are cumulative across all clients. But maybe I want to see this report separated by client, one for readability, but also two to subtotal these columns in here. So how many actual hours have been entered to Acme projects? What's the current budget of all of those projects, both in hours and in terms of the gross? You know, how much have we billed for them? Those are all fields that we have in here. So if I add a grouping to this, this process is the exact same as adding a column, but obviously we get different results here. So if I add the client name to this, just as an example, and I apply these changes, Workamajig will go ahead and do that. And again, I have to search here so it does the actual categorizations for me. But in here now I get subtotals for each client. So if I start collapsing these, or if I click more and I tell the report to collapse all of them, it starts with that grouping, right? These are the clients that I have in my system. Here are the subtotals for the hours, the budget, all of these different pieces that have been entered for them here since we've, this is for all time, but you know, you can of course be specific about your date ranges. So that grouping comes into play here. Within the modify, again, you can have multiple levels of grouping. So we could, for example, go by client, then campaign, and then project. Again, understanding the hierarchy of how this data works is very helpful here. But really, it's kind of whatever you could dream up in terms of how you want these to work, you could add them. So campaign would be a decent one here. If you have parent clients, again, that's another area I could add another grouping, but you can have multiple levels of grouping saying, okay, we have a parent client, Acme Incorporated, but they also have an Anvil division or an Anvil child client that I'd like to report out on separately. So you can kind of group all of those together. Real quick, before I jump into filters, I did have a question here. If you don't see the modify icon, that is a permission setting. Yeah, you have to have the rights to create or adjust custom reports. So that's something you'd want to reach out to your local admin for. Okay, so looking further into how these reports are built here, A few other notes on the columns before we jump over to the filters. You'll notice within the columns, we have the actual field name. This will always be what we called the field. This just kind of is how how our report engine is going to reference this detail. You can caption these fields whatever you like. So I could change project type to Bugs Bunny or whatever. And the report builder will have that new name. We'll just put new name in here for this one for now for project type. So the field is actually project type, but the caption is whatever we want to call it within the report itself. Outside of that, we also have the ability to set the sort type. This can be ascending or descending. That's what these stand for here. In the sort order. So what should we sort first? And right now it's sorting by client ID and name, but it might make more sense for me to start by project number, just as an example. That's really up to you how you want to handle this, but project number basically just says, okay, go in ascending order for the project number first here when we're grouping this detail, and you'll see that bear out when we look at these. They'll start to number sequentially, right? Job 1, 3, 5, 8. Looks like I've probably deleted some in here, so I have some gaps, but you can see it kind of counts up here because I told the report, hey, I want this field to sort first, and I want it to sort ascending. You can also sort descending, so it counts down. That's very useful in particular for date fields within your columns if you want everything to line up by date, or if you want the invoice numbers to be sequentially in a report. This is a really useful tool for you. Word wrap is what you think it is. If there's more data than there is space in the field here, will we wrap it in the report, or will we just kind of clip it? You'll only see data type and formula for calculated columns. I'm going to get back to these here in a moment, but you can run calculations on columns within these reports here. This one, I'm just taking the budget minus the amount billed. So we'll get to how to build these and how those work in just a second. But before we do that, let's go ahead and jump over to the filters. Now, within the filters, this is where you can set, of course, what you want to filter on the report. And there's two major types of filters, both relating to this prompt field here. If prompt is filled in here, if it has this little checkbox, basically what that means is when we pull up the report in the first place, it's going to prompt you as to whether or not you want to use these. Now, they'll typically default to no data in them. So I can say, you know what, I only want to see active projects, for example. Let's search this and it will refine my search for me. I only want to see projects for a certain account manager or for a certain client. Those are all fine here. Those all come from this filters area in the modify area of a report. And so prompt is just saying, okay, I'm going to prompt you. If you want to use it, great. If not, no problem. But we're here if you need us. The other type of this is non-prompted filters. And this basically just says to the report, hey, whenever this report is run, automatically automatically filtered to this without a prompt. And those are more stark. You'll see them very consistently in any view that's not an all view, right? I'm looking at all projects, so there's really nothing unprompted that's filtering out data. But if I go back to my views area and I look at my active projects report, for example, it's really the same report as all projects by default. The major difference with it is in the filters. We have a non-prompted filter. So you see the prompt is unchecked here for active, basically telling the report, hey, I want any project in this report to be active by yes. I want you to do that automatically without having to give me a filter for it. So I've got this one up at the top. If I look at my report, it's not here, right? Hidden from us. And so that's another reason I tell my clients when I'm training them on how to use the reporting engine to start with the all views, because there can sometimes be sneaky non-prompted filters you don't know about that's hiding data from you. And that's definitely not something you want when you build a report. You want all of those non-prompted filters to be intentional. Even if you're copying it with intention, that's perfectly fine. Just again, make sure that you know what the implication of this is here when you're actually building them. Now, the filters themselves will have a field and a condition, right? So which field are we filtering by? This is the same exact list of fields that you have available in that layout area for the groups or columns. Same thing, just obviously different function. And when you add a filter to a report, the system is going to ask you what the condition is. Now, the most common is equal to. That's actually the default as well. So if I come in here and say, hey, I don't want to see any projects that don't have actual hours, kind of a goofy filter. Or, I want to see projects with a start date of, project start date of if I prompt for values here, a project start date of whatever you enter in here, right? It could filter to only projects that have that specific date range. Now, that's the first thing we ask for is what field do you want to filter by? From there, the condition, right? How do you want us to handle this? So the default is equal to, that's the most widely used of these conditions here, but there's actually quite a few of them in here. And again, you don't necessarily have to look through this whole list. Some of them are a lot of them are date specific, right? This month, next month. So I could say, hey, I want to see only projects with a start date of this month. That's something I could do in this. This would be a non-prompted filter because it just kind of rolls through from month to month. We'll talk more about these date conditionals, but the most consistently used conditions are up here towards the top. Equal to, not equal to, begins with. Of particular use are equal to, not equal to, and between. This is really great for date ranges, right? So project start date, I can either do something like I was doing earlier where I say, oh, the project start date is this month or last month or whatever date range I would look at, or I can say, let's just go ahead and say that the project start date is between two dates. I could even tell the system to prompt for values. And if I apply those changes and I pull these filters out, it's exactly what we get, right? A between range. So I could say, oh, I only want to see projects that have started this year. I could manually enter those dates and the system would pick those up for us. There's quite a few conditions in here, again, so you may find some that are very specific, situationally useful. Filters like is after is typically a date filter. There's less than, there's greater than, there's not between a specific date range. So there's a lot of different conditionals that you can kind of use here. But just a matter of kind of scrolling through and finding the one that works the best for you. And also tucked away at the bottom here is our any of filter saying, oh, hey, I may want to filter to multiple conditionals. I think a good field for this would be like client name or ID. So if I'm looking at client ID, I can say, let's set this to an any of filter. Let me go ahead and just try that again because I goofed on it. And I keep clicking buttons I don't need there. There we go. Okay, so if I say, okay, client ID is any of, same idea that it's a filter, but when I actually come in to use this filter here, I can tell it, hey, I want these 3 clients, and that's all I want, right? So we can select multiple of the same client types without having to say, oh, I got to pull this report 3 times. So all of those conditions will work whether the report is prompted or non-prompted. Again, just the difference being whether or not we're asking you for this information or we're just going ahead and filtering to a certain condition like active equals yes. Just a note on the prompt values for filters. If I enter, like if I do project start date again here, and I tell the system not to prompt for values, we require you to tell us what that value is, right? We need to know what you're filtering. So just know that that's the case. If we try to save it without putting a value in here, typically this will highlight in red and it will just say, hey, you got to tell us what you're looking for. Then in the settings here, the settings are really where you set the name for your report. So if you see that report name, active projects, that's where that came from here. There's some details about how you would want this report to print either physically or to a PDF or something like that. If you print it, you can add a description here. This again is just for users to see, hey, this report's for active projects, but you may have some that are a little bit more specific that have a very specific purpose. This is a client specific report to make sure we're not exceeding X number of hours per month, something like that. You can put that in here. So, anyone else using this report would have that detail there. In the upper right-hand corner here, there's a few options as well. Show search conditions, one of those options. This is if you print the report, do we print the filter conditions with it? I find that very, very useful. If you're sending someone a report that says, hey, this is filtered to projects that were started last month. This is filtered to projects that don't have a budget, something like that. And by default, Workamajig does not run views when they're open. You may have noticed that, right? If I jump into a brand new view, it just gives me a big blank white page here with no detail into it. And that's because of this setting right here. We do that partially because some report types can have an extremely high amount of data, specifically like time or transaction reports. I've had clients that have pulled multiple hundreds of thousands of lines into the same report. Obviously, that can take a little bit of time when you go about it that way. So depending on the report type that you're looking at, I'm probably safe with projects, especially if it's like active projects, to tell the system to run this when opened. But this is really meant to be a time saver for you on certain reports that may have huge amounts of data and you want to apply your filters before you actually pull that information. There are pivot tables on these. I'll show you how those work a little bit. You can default your report table to that pivot view if you'd like. And we also have an option here for private. Now, any custom report that you create is going to be private by default, which basically means only the owner, which will be you, if you made the report, will be able to open the report. And that even that applies to admins as well. So if you're an admin and you don't have access to a report, you actually won't be able to see it here in the system. So this kind of almost bears repeating because it's something very common. I see when users are building reports, they say, hey, I built a report. It works great. I really like it, but I'm the only one that can see it. And I'd like to share it with the rest of the team. This is really how you do that. So if I just made this all projects report, I could uncheck the private option here. And then we'll get this visible to area that says, okay, for the security groups in your system, which users by security group should be able to access and open this report. Now, this is an all projects report. We're probably not going to be too restrictive about the level of detail that we have in here. But again, you can pick and choose and say, you know what, I don't want vendors or freelancers and clients to open this report type if they have access to the system. Let's go ahead and hide them from those security groups, but we'll leave it visible to everyone else. And again, if we're opening a new report, you always want to make sure that you uncheck this private option and set who specifically by security group would be able to access and view this report. Okay. I'm going to keep forging ahead, but again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to jump in here. You may have noticed here when I was applying my changes here too. So when you click apply changes, the system will actually go ahead and make a one-time change to the report. But just note that your report is not permanently changed until you click this memorize button. This is another thing that will catch new users when they're building reports here in Workamajig. We kind of allow for you to make a one-time change if you're just trying to get some very specific data out of the system, but don't want to fundamentally change the report structure itself. So again, this memorize option only applies or only appears here if we see something different in the report as it's constructed currently versus how you opened it up. And if you click memorize, it will save those changes permanently to the report itself. Now, there's a few other things I want to talk about here on the view side before we jump into building custom reports from the ground up here. One of those is your calculated columns and potentially calculated filters. Calculated columns give you the ability to run math calculations on any of the detail that's in the report itself. So for this one, I have a calculated column. Again, that calculated column is taking the current total budget minus the amount billed. And it's spitting that detail out for us. And for some reason, I don't have this subtotaled, but that's fine. When you build one of these, it's going to give you that screen like we just saw there. We're going to ask you how you want to caption the field because we don't know what to call it. We're going to ask you what the data type is. There's three options in here: number, text, or date. This is also another easy one to forget here for the type of detail that you have. And the formula will actually spit out whatever detail you're looking for. So this will accept some simple SQL commands even to allow you to do things like avoid divide by zero errors if you're doing division. You can also tell it to, in the grouping, if you do a calculated group, to represent it as a specific caption. That's part of the reason we have the other data types. But the most common use for a calculated field is to run math calculations on the actual data, numeric data that's in the system. And on the right-hand side here, we have all of your available fields. Again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend scrolling through the whole list. It's easier typically just to say, okay, I want to look at my budget options. These are all of the budget options. There's a lot of them. And just a side note, current total budget or current budget reflects the current reality of the budget on the project. A lot of the other fields like original or CO budget, those are specific to, okay, what do we start with? What is the actual change order budget? Current is always showing you the current state of the budget. Seems intuitive, but there's so many budget fields in here that I think it's worth pointing out. So to build a field like the one that we had here for the build variance budget, or let's say we want to build one for the number of budgeted hours minus the number of actual hours to kind of get an idea of what's left on the project here, I can take the current total budget hours, right? So if I look at current total budget, there's our original budget hours. Here's our current budget hours, right? So if I click on this, it's going to create that field in here for you with these brackets. If you're referencing a field in Workamajig using a calculated field, you always have to have these brackets around the outside so that the report engine knows that it's looking at a field and not just some text in here. So we'll say that this is remaining hours. Right, so we have our current budget hours. From here, I can add my operator. So if I want to add, if I want to subtract, those are all here. You can, of course, divide or multiply. All of those things work as well. And if you add parentheses, you can add kind of an order of operations to this. So, you know, it wouldn't apply too well to this particular calculation I'm running here. But I could say, okay, this minus this times 100 or something like that, right? This divided by this times 100 if I want a percentage. So for current budget hours here, we have that in here. Now let's go ahead and find the actual hours. Again, I'm going to type in hours. There they are, actual hours. And one thing that the report engine does here that I'd like to recommend looking out for is when you add a second field to this, we add a plus operator automatically. That's kind of the most commonly used one in here. I've been caught by this a ton where I come in and say, actually, I want to say minus, and then I end up with plus and minus, and the report engine doesn't like this because it doesn't know what to do with it. So we're going to go ahead and get rid of that one and say, okay, I want the current total budget minus the actual hours, and that's really all I need, right? I can even subtotal this if I want to. That will subtotal within a grouping or for the report as a whole if we select this. Now you can add a sort to these, you can add subtotals to them. But when you save it, it adds you a calculated column. We will always name the fields calc underscore column underscore a number here. You'll see this little calculator next to the fields themselves to show you there is a calculation that's being run here. And when we look at this, let's go ahead and put this right after actual hours right there so that these all kind of feed in together. So we're looking at current total budget minus the actual hours. That gets us our remaining hours field that we created here. Now, I built this. Oftentimes reports, I don't remember if this data set has remaining hours. I don't think it does. But some reports will actually do this for you all automatically, things like this. But if we're missing this, of course, a calculation is a great way to go here. So again, I'm going to apply changes to make the one-time change to my report. I'm going to go ahead and click search. And Workamajig will run that calculation, right? So our budget hours, our actual hours, there's our return. And I've told it subtotal, so apparently we're in the negative for the number of remaining hours we have based off of the budget, which again checks out. And like I said, this does apply from a grouping level as well. So we can see overall for this client, we have 800, we've used 552. This isn't really time range specific, it's just kind of overall, but you still hopefully at least get the idea of how this is meant to work, right? I can build my own columns into here using functions within the report engine to, to get those calculations spit out of the system here. Okay. Now, so that's one of the big pieces here. One of the other big pieces that I left off here that I should have probably led with is how do you get a view? I mentioned that you copy these views. So if we're looking at the view here for projects, we don't really have a plus button for views here, right? We're basically saying, okay, I want to start with one of these views. So again, I'm starting with all projects. If I want a new view, I again go into that same modify area there. And I click the more button and tell Workamajig to copy this view. So we'll do just that. It will copy the view exactly how you have it. Once you confirm this here, it's going to name your view copy of whatever view that you copied from. So this one is now copy of all projects. I will almost certainly want to rename this at some point. Let's say it's, you know, projects by client, something like that, or project status, project health. Like I mentioned, when you create a new report, they are private to you when you start. So if you want to uncheck this, you can select who should have visibility access to this. Kind of a pretty big one there, but now I've renamed it to projects by client. I could have left it a copy of all projects. That's fine too. But when we look in this projects area, there it is, right? I have a brand new view and you can make as many of these as you'd like. That's typically the process that you would go through to create a new view in the system here. I have a question here asking if you can share a report with an individual person within a group or just the group. It's really just the group. right? We look at the group level rights. You can do things like create custom security groups that only contain a certain number of people that should have higher report access. So if you have, creatives and creatives with additional reporting, we can copy a security group and put those users in it to kind of do that. But really, a report does have to be shared with a specific security group. Okay, we're going to move on from views here and go into the custom reports area here. If you have any other questions, please feel free to put those into the Q&A and the chat. Raise your hand, any of those things. And we'll go ahead and take a look at that here. But hopefully the idea of views makes sense. Now, I primarily looked at projects, but this applies to anything, right? So if I come into billing today and I look at that same list, if I'm more on the finance side of things, I can create reports for client invoices. Again, we have a few in the system here already for things like credits and invoices and OpenAR and things like that. Excuse me. So you can create these views from here as well. All of what I said applies. You're just obviously going to see different fields that you can select in here, and we're getting one line per client invoice. Now, let's go ahead and pivot over to the report center here. If we look at the report center, this is an area for two different things. Number one, it has a list of standard reports. Many of these standard reports have some customization made to them by our engineering team to kind of make them a little bit more readable or a little bit more functional. Many of them are very familiar standard reports that you would expect to find in a project management or finance software. And just like before with the question of security, what you see in here is going to be based off of what your security rights are. So if you're more on the PM side of things, for example, you may not see the list of financial reports. If you're in finance, you likely will see everything, but let's say there's a chance you don't see traffic reports, right? Each one of these report groupings has security rights around them that would allow you to access or not to see them. And with both of these standard reports, there's additional security rights surrounding whether or not you can see information in here. There's some rights, for example, on project visibility. If you don't have rights to see projects you're not a part of, you would also not see them in standard reports that you pull, either here or in the views area. If you don't have the ability to view labor net or payroll information, again, their fields may be in these standard reports at least, but you wouldn't see that in the output for them. But one of the major reasons I want to bring it here, and kind of part of the reason for our webinar here, is building custom reports in this area. And this is a little bit of a different approach to building custom reports than using views. With views, I know I'm starting with one line per whatever view I'm looking at. In our custom report center, we will show you all of the data sets that you have access to. And I'm going to click new custom report here. But real quick before I do, again, this is another area where security comes into play in a large way. Each security group in Workamajig has a set of data sets that they're allowed to use. Those, of course, can be adjusted. But when I click the plus custom report here, it's going to show you every data set that you can use. I'm an admin in this instance. So when I click plus new custom report, it's going to give us all of the different data sets that you can use. And these are typically grouped by the category that you'd use them for, right? So our contact management reports, our project reports, our billing reports, our traffic reports. These are all of the data sets that you can select from. This is a searchable list. So again, if I am a project manager and I want to create project reports, I could just type in project and it will show you all of the information there. Again, don't let this overwhelm you. A lot of these are very specific report types. So kind of just searching for what you need in here will typically get you at least on the path for it. If you're building a report for projects and you want a quick summary by account manager or something like that, you probably don't want project billing schedule data, right? That's not really going to help you. And a lot of these, the names will be pretty evocative of what you're going to get out of the report itself. But there is some text underneath each one of these to let you know what to expect out of the data set. And most of them will let you know there is one line per something, right? So in this case, we're looking at one line item per project and billing schedule entry. If we're looking at time detail, for example, there is one line per time entry into the system. So I want to build a time detail report in here. Again, what you see in this list may be a little bit more limited than what I see. I kind of hope that's the case for a lot of you. If it's your first time in here, I just think seeing this big, large list can be a little bit daunting. But starting with the right data set's very key to building the report that you're looking for. So this kind of comes back to that discussion of the hierarchy of data I was talking about. I have campaigns that have projects in them. Those projects have tasks. Those tasks have time entries. Those time entries are made by people. It's kind of walking down, the hierarchy of where we're looking. So if we're looking at a very, very bottom level report, kind of the transaction level detail, there's two major options that you have. The first one are going to be our time detail reports. There are 3 of them, based off of whether or not you have access to labor net or not. No costs is just that. It's saying no inside cost for these time transactions. We're just showing you the time detail. Again, there's 1 row per time entry, so that's each one of these here. There's also a timesheet level data. So again, this is up the chain of the data a little bit. It says, don't just give me every individual time entry on a timesheet. I want to see all of the time entries on a specific day. I don't want that level of granularity. So these are 2 different tiers, right? This would be kind of the raw data. This would be the first grouping of that raw data, right? There's individual time entries. I may have 5 lines on a timesheet. So I can have 5 lines in the report for that timesheet, or I could have just the 1 line for the date that time was entered. And there's a lot of different ways to approach that. But again, just hopefully that makes sense how we're looking at these. So these 3 traffic reports for time detail data are all raw time entries. It's only time entries, and it's 1 line for each individual entry on a timesheet. The other one would be your project cost transaction data. This combines both project time and expenses. So any vendor invoices, purchase orders, miscellaneous costs, credit card charges, those would also be in here as well. And this very closely mirrors and actually is the same data set as what you would see if you go into a project and you click transactions. Right, so if I open this project, any project in the system, this transactions area here is the same as this custom data set. The major difference, of course, being if I build one here in the report center, I'm not looking at 1 project worth of transactions. I'm looking at multiple projects worth of transactions. Now, I'm going to go ahead and build a time detail data report here so we can look at this together. We're going to build one on the no costs area here. I'm going to start this, and if you start a custom report here, we always start it as blank. But before we jump into this, I got a couple of questions here real quick, and then we'll go ahead and start to build this together. I had a question about whether if you're pulling a report and the data isn't populating at the lowest level, what do you do, or what if that's happening? Typically, that sounds like it's just a data set issue. You want to make sure you're looking in a specific area. So like I mentioned before, if I am pulling a projects report, I can spit out actual hours, but I can't really dive too much into the details of what those actual hours look like. And if that's something I want, I probably want to come here and build something like a time detail report. Right, it's just a matter of looking at the right data set of information. Projects have time on them. We can report on the overall detail of them. But if I want specifics on who entered it, what date, what service, how many hours, by individual person, I probably want to look at a lower level in the hierarchy of data. I have another question here about, does Workamajig have a cheat sheet or article on common formula calculations? We really don't yet. It might be something we do here in the future. Oftentimes you can ask your account manager for help on things. I think the most consistent issue that we see are divide by 0 errors. But the problem is I could just throw a formula at you, but understanding necessarily kind of what it does may not help. So oftentimes if you're stuck somewhere with those, I would definitely say to reach out to your account manager. I know I'm personally always happy to build reports or help adjust them. But yeah, we don't really have a cheat sheet currently yet on what those formula calculations look like, or the common ones here. Okay, so when we're building a new report here, the same ideas apply, right? We're going to look at the type of groupings we have. We're going to look at the columns. We're also going to add some filters, but I like to start with the columns, right? Or potentially the groupings, depending on how I'm approaching this. And we're just going to make a raw time detail report here. So when we come through here, we're inserting the rows to add the detail. And I'm going to say, let's start with the date worked first, right? There's a lot of different date fields for time entries, but we're just going to say date worked. Let's add the person's name, the name of the person that entered them. So I'm going to go ahead and enter this. It's actually down here towards the bottom. It's user name or user full name. We'll do user full name in this instance. Let's grab the service description for the time that they entered time to. The project that they entered time to, also probably pretty useful. Grab project number and put it right up here. Let's say that we want to see the task name or ID. Let's do task name. And then we'll cap this off with the actual hours, right? So how many hours did they actually work in this period? So this will get me a report that spits out all of the time entries with all of the individual dates here. Again, I can group this, but we'll come back to that. And for time detail or for any raw data report, and for most reports, you typically at the very least want a date filter, right? So I'm going to come in here and say, okay, I'm going to grab date. In this case, I want date worked. There's a lot of different date fields in this report that I can work with, but date worked is the actual date on the time entry. So I'm going to grab that. Being equal to a specific date, not super useful. So I think I'll go ahead and change my condition to a between here, and I'll have the system prompt the user for values. And then let's add a few other filters for the client name, the project name, just a few things that allow us to be really specific about what we're looking for here. And then maybe the username, and let's use an any of on this one, right? So we can search multiple users. So all of these are prompted here. I have a layout of a simple report setup. I have some filters here that we can use. And when we save this for the first time here, it's going to name it after the data set. So if I wanted to change it to something else, I of course could do that. I'm going to go ahead and leave it set to its custom name for now. And when you save it, it will go ahead and slide that report open here for you and allow you to filter these. So I'm going to only filter the time entries I've made this year. I don't have too many in my system right now, but let's see, it's 24. Okay. But we'll go ahead and filter into these date ranges for raw transaction reports. Again, that's typically the best way to go here. And again, now we're going to get a spit out of all of those fields that we just asked for, right? What date did this user work? What's their name? What project did they enter time to? What's the task, service, actual hours? All of those things are popping into here according to what we set this for. So again, I can make this a little bit more readable. This is just a bunch of raw data. It looks like 51 different entries here for mine right now that have been made this year. We can actually sort by these columns too. So if I wasn't already sorting by the date worked, or if I wanted to change it to descending instead of ascending, I could click it again. It would go backwards here and kind of move these around. And again, I can add groupings to this too. So if I want to be a bit more specific and say, hey, I want to see the number of hours entered per client with all of the detail, I could add that grouping here, apply my changes, search it again. And again, that's exactly what we get for this client. These are the time entries that are made. For this client, these are the time entries. And I mentioned before that you can add multiple levels of groupings in here. So if I go back into edit this again and say, okay, I don't just want to know the client, I also want this detailed group by the project name or the project number. We'll say project full name. How about that? So client, then project, that gets us those multiple groupings. I'm going to research this again, and it'll say, okay, here's your client, here's your project. And the strength for this is that I can collapse either of these two levels of detail and get subtotals for them, right? So if I'm looking at actual hours worked, bam, there we go. 123 hours entered this year to Acme projects, specifically to this one here. So I only have one project for this client, so there's not too much to group underneath them here. Thought I'd done a couple, but I guess I didn't. But you can kind of see how this works. And if I open up the date range, maybe that'll make this work a little better for us. So let's look since the beginning of last year. Same idea, we're just looking at a few additional lines. So now within Acme themselves, I can even, again, collapse all of the fields if I want here and start to drill down to say, okay, for Acme, we had 552 hours entered since last year. If I open this, it will show me all of the projects that we've had since we grouped that way, again, subtotaling that detail. And then I can jump into the raw data if I want to, kind of grouped or filtered however you'd like here. So you can see kind of working with raw data really gives you the ability to build up into these very specific report types. I could look at, hours by client, hours by project, or client then project. I could look at it by specific user, service, and again, I could have groupings for any of those things. I can go really far down here. I could have, 3, 4, 5, 6 groupings if I'd like, depending on the need of the report. But you can do that here as well. One of the other things I wanted to point out, if we don't have groupings, is that you can also group the rows together in a report. So I can start with raw data, like we see here, where I just spit out a whole bunch of information, but I can also group that. So now, one of the things I'm going to do here is to remove some of the identical pieces. But when we group these rows together, what this does effectively is it says, okay, we're going to look at each line and ask you how you want us to handle the grouping for them. So right now what it's doing is it's summing all of the actual hours where all of these grouped fields are the same. So if it's the same date, the same user, the same project, the same task, it's going to group those together. Since I have date in here, it's not going to do too much grouping for us. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the date. We'll leave the user. Let's leave the project number for now, and let's get rid of the task name, and let's get rid of the service. So we're going to keep this really simple. User, the project, and the hours. Since I've told it to group it together, it's saying, okay, wherever I find the same user or the same project, sum the hours that are on that line. So if I apply this now and I search it, we're going to go from 214 rows to significantly less. The data is still here, but it's grouping according to how I asked the system to do this, right? So it says for this user on this project, 15 hours. And that's really what the grouping function will do for you. That's especially useful in granular reports like this one here. So this kind of allows you to go in and get those groupings directly into the report here. And again, just note that adding certain lines that can't group together easily, like a date field, if I add date worked to this, there's not much grouping that we can do because the date has to be the same for it to group the lines. So for Ada here, now we end up with a bunch of lines because the date worked is different on each one of these. Wherever it finds a match for this date, project, and user, it will add the actual hours together and kind of remove duplicated lines. But certain fields will kind of make this a little bit more difficult from the grouping side. One other thing here too, before I want to jump at pivot tables, and I want to make sure I give a few minutes for questions here at the end of the call. But one of the things I wanted to mention here too, when we have a grouping is if I group for something like client name, for example, you'll see as soon as you have any grouping, whether or not you want to auto expand grouped rows. And I find this very useful as well, because if I add a grouping here to these reports, I can basically have the system spit out. Didn't I tell it not to? Oh, it did. Okay, great. I can have it kind of create those grouped rows here for me and have them start as collapsed just like this, right? So this kind of allows me to say, okay, I have these groupings with the top level detail, and then I can decide which one I want to jump into. I can say, hey, I want to look here, see those time entries. Great. We can look here. Just allows you to create a grouping without having the groups open automatically. And don't forget about your expand or collapse all here in the more button. These are also very useful instead of having to click each individual line. Those also work there for you. Now, quickly, I want to spend a few minutes here on pivot tables, which is our fourth option here. This allows you to pivot within Workamajig here. This works in a fairly similar vein to pivot tables you'd see in Excel or in external pieces here. And it's looking at only the items that are currently within the report, right? So I could say you typically don't want to use the filters here, just use the filters on the report, but the rest of these pieces are what rows, what columns, and what values do we want, right? So I could say, you know what, I want a row for the client, I want a column for the user, and I want the value to be the actual hours worked. This will actually get us a pivot table. So if I apply my changes here, as soon as you've created a pivot table, they'll show up here on the upper right-hand side, and it'll let you toggle between the two. You can say, okay, I want to look at this as a grid, or I want to look at the pivot table for it. And the pivot table will do exactly what you think here, right? Here's my column that I set by client. I wanted to know this. Then the actual users are over here. Kind of cleared my detail out somehow. This one right there. And so it'll show you, okay, so Ada entered, these different hours here, and this is printable just like your grid view reports would be as well. So it kind of gives you those totals. Now, obviously, you can get a lot more complicated than what I've done here. I could add things to this report like service. For example, if I add the field for service description to this, it will also show up in my pivot table. And I could say, okay, I want another column for that here to kind of break out that detail a little bit further. And when I pop this open, it'll say, okay, Ada has entered time to these different services with this information. So again, fairly similar to what you'd see in a pivot table outside of Workamajig. Tends to be very useful in raw transaction reports like these, but you can build pivot tables into these. And again, after you do, just a reminder, in the settings here, you can tell Workamajig to open the report directly to the pivot view first if you'd like. Excuse me. The print for the pivot view, by the way, is actually in here. I showed it up here for this print. This is actually for our grid, but in the drop downs here, out of here, you can actually print this information to Excel or CSV directly from the pivot table. So you have to build these before you see them, but once you do, they will be in the custom report itself. John, hopefully that answers your question about pivot tables. If you have any more specifics you'd like to ask, I'm definitely open to those here. But that's how you get the pivot tables. You got to go in that edit area there and actually build it first. And I have a question here from another person saying that they want to pull reports. Many times they pull reports into Excel and sort and calculate. What's the best way to do that so the data is on the same line? So, for example, sometimes the name is on a different line than the hours, or the sum doesn't have a description on the same line. So for reports that you want to adjust in Excel, I almost always recommend not having groupings in the system and actually using this function. This is actually one of the reasons why we'd say, okay, you know what, I don't want groups, but I want to group data together. Or maybe you do want all of the raw detail together. But yeah, that creates kind of a stagger on the Excel spreadsheet. If we have those groupings, it makes it a little bit harder to kind of manipulate the data. It's almost always easier to export it without these groups first, and then adjust it from there. But hopefully you can, you'll be able to do a lot of that here in system first. Most of the time, we can perform the sort of calculations that you're doing outside of Workamajig in the system, so long as they're in the same data sets here. So that's definitely something we're interested in. If there's something you have to do in Excel that you can't do in Workamajig, please let me or your account manager know. Those are definitely things that we'd like to take a look at. Oftentimes we can help you find a solution here in system and hopefully save you some time. But if you have to pull some things out to Excel, or you're combining multiple different data sets to get a very specific report view, typically you want something like this where you just have the columns. You might or might not group the rows together, but I would avoid adding groupings to those to make them easier to work with. All right, and then Cindy has a question on how to schedule a daily report or just some information on those. That was definitely something I wanted to talk about here today. If you build a custom report or view here in Workamajig, underneath the More button, you'll see the option to either create a schedule or to view your existing scheduled reports. Now, if you create a new schedule, basically what we do, and we don't show you this option until you've searched, basically what we do is we take the filter conditions as you have them set currently, and we say, okay, we're going to recreate these filter conditions over and over again and send you a report on a scheduled basis. Now, obviously, for this one currently, that wouldn't work very well because we're basically going to be sending the same exact report every day or week or month or however often we send it. That is, again, where those filters come into play very well. So I can build a report that has a rolling date range for me. For example, I could say the date work is last month or last year, last week, whichever one. Let's say this is a weekly time report. We just kind of spit it out each one. If I do this and I say date work last week without a prompt here, and I search this report, it will always look at last week. So whether it is 1/24 of 2023 or the middle of June of next year, it will always say last week, right? Whatever the last week currently is. And that makes this ability to schedule these a lot more useful. So you can do things like, hey, I want to see a report of all new projects that were opened. I want to see a report of all time entries, all client invoices that were entered per week. Once you build the report with the filter parameters that you want, you can even add your prompted filters in here. We would consider those as well. So if I say, oh, just for this one client, actually, if I schedule a report, it would have that condition, but I'm going to just do it for all. And if I click new schedule, excuse me, Workamajig will pull out the scheduling piece here. And there's two things to look at in here. Number one, who we're actually sending this email to. Right, so we'd say, okay, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, I want to send this to Ada Lovelace, right? She's going to get an email. And then from here, I set how often we actually send it, right? So if I click into my schedule details, you can add a description, you can add the schedule name to this if you'd like. But the big pieces are, when do we want this to run, what time of day? So let's say we run it at 9 a.m. Let's say that we send it every week on Monday morning at 9 a.m., right? Just a big list of time entries that were entered last week. And when you save this, it will let you go ahead and schedule this report. It will automatically run it and send it to you or whoever you specify in the email to field here on whatever time frame that you're looking for. Now, you can set these to expire. You can say, oh, I want this to run through the end of the year, something like that. By default, they have no end date, so they will run for time immemorial. Within a report, you can see the scheduled reports that have been created for it. Actually, within the schedule here itself, we will also show you every iteration of this report having been generated. So as soon as it sends out the first one, it will have a list in here. And if this has been open for a while, it would show you each instance of those reports having been sent from the system. And one thing I like to point out with the scheduled reports here is there is an area, if you have the security rights to view it, in your system setup. So under admin manager system setup and then global list to view all of your scheduled reports. This is very useful if you want to clean these up or if you want to just double check where they're going and how often in one place. This is the best place to do that. It will give you all of those scheduled reports, when their start times are, who we're going to send them to, and allow you to adjust them directly from this screen if you'd like. Okay, so there's a lot to the reporting engine here in Workamajig. There's a lot of different ways to run reports in the system here. I would highly recommend, if you have a specific report that you'd like to build, if you need any help with it, this is definitely something we're always happy to help with here. So don't hesitate to reach out to your account manager for these. Oftentimes with my clients, I feel it's very helpful for me to kind of at least get them started with, hey, here's the data set and here's a few pieces, and you'll find you pick this stuff up pretty quickly. Yeah, so you'll pick this stuff up pretty quickly, and you know, that's a good way to go there. But I just want to make sure that, you know, if you have reporting questions, you can reach out to us here at support@workamajig.com. Don't hesitate to do that if you get stuck. I know there's a little bit of a curve with these, so I would highly recommend, if you're new to them here, again, starting with the views. This is a really great way to go. These tend to be pretty easy to work with. And then from there, once you're starting to get a bit comfortable with these, or if they're not quite getting you what you want, then the custom report center is a really great place to go. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful for everybody. I want to thank you all for coming. I have a couple of questions here. I'm going to go ahead and grab these here and answer them. So if you have a few minutes to stick around for that, great. If not, thank you so much for coming, and thanks for being Workamajig users. I did have a question here from Suzanne about scheduled reports. If you make any changes, you have to delete and reset up. I believe that's the case, but honestly, Suzanne, I can't remember off the top of my head. I think that if you make changes to the columns of the report, it will actually pick it up in the report and send them out, but I would have to confirm that, because I think the only things we save in the report schedule are the actual filter items. So if I look at that same report that we were just on, let me go back to that here and I look at the schedule. When you look at this, it will show you the filter criteria, right? So the only thing I filtered to is last week. I think this is all the report grabs. It grabs this filter criteria and then goes back to the report to regenerate it. But I would have to test them. So sorry, I can't remember. If you add somebody to the email list, you can. Yes, if you add someone to the email list, it will pick them up on the next iteration. So if I add Ada here, the first email sends out, and I decide, oh, next week I need to add Candace to this as well, I can do that, and it will just start adding Candace to the emails that run for these. Okay. Can we run a report using the qualifiers that will allow us to pull projects where the hours have exceeded a specified percentage of the budget hours? You probably could do that with only projects that go above a certain percentage. We'd have to do a calculated filter for that. That's not really something I talked too much about in the presentation here today. But just like your calculated columns, you can make calculated filters. So you'd have to do a filter where you'd say, okay, when X divided by Y times 100 is less than or greater than, let's say 85%, so greater than 85, then report only those projects. That's definitely something that we could do. That is definitely not a first-time project or first-time report typically for people, but yeah, you'd want to create a calculated filter where you say, okay, you know, this field or this calculation has this value. And you kind of come in here and add that detail. There's probably a few other ways to do that, but I would recommend reaching out to your account manager for that one. What we could probably help cook something up for you to get a report that returns only that detail. Okay. Anyone else have any questions here? Okay, perfect. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming to this webinar here. Hopefully you took away something valuable from it. Again, feel free to follow this up if you have any questions or you want any specific report requests to reach out to us at support@workamajig.com. We'll be happy to help you if there's anything we can do. All right, everybody. Thanks again. Have a great day.